Hi, everybody. I'm Leon Fers, and this 45-minute webinar is called Attack Your Assessments. That might sound a little bit aggressive, but what I'm going to do is take you through a process of breaking down your existing assessments and then using our AI assessment scale to review them and make some necessary adjustments to cope with generative artificial intelligence. This webinar is going out to my community and is available as part of the resources from practicalaistrategies.com. Make sure you go to either leonfurs.com or practicalaistrategies.com to check out more of these kinds of resources. So I'll go through a quick overview of the process that I'll talk about in this session. First of all, what we're going to do essentially is we'll take an existing assessment and then we're going to review the assessment against the outcomes, ascertain whether it really assesses what we mean to assess, and then introduce artificial intelligence. We're going to use the best available AI systems to try to complete the assessment, to attack the assessment, if you like. And then eventually we're going to redesign the assessment. So in this webinar, I'm going to talk through the entire process. I'm going to give some examples, and I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment validity and where I get my language of assessment validity from, particularly in the Australian K-12 curriculum context. I'm going to use some examples of assessments which I've created as a composite from other schools that I've worked with and from my own assessments in the past. So it's important to point out that the assessment examples I'm going to provide are not real and they're not from real schools. Though the name of the school that ChatGPT generated when I created my little combined assessments is actually the name of a real school here in Australia. So I promise it's not that school. These aren't real assessments. These are just composites that I'm going to use for the example. So the way I'm going to go through this is I'll show you a quick fly through of each of these assessments. One from English, which is a writing folio task, which involves two submissions, 800 to 1,000 words with a written reflection. A business studies style task where we have to produce a comparative report between a small and medium enterprise and a large business. And a history or humanities task where we have some AI work and also a research task and a written report component. It doesn't really matter at this stage what these assessments are. So these could be anything. These could be secondary school assessments. They could be tertiary level assessments. I've actually made a composite here which draws on some of the Year 11 and 12 K-12 assessments that I've worked with and some tertiary studies assessments, especially the business studies or business management one. I'm going to go through each of these assessments in turn, describe the assessment task, briefly look at the criteria. And whilst I'm doing this, I want you to reflect on your own assessments, whatever subject area and whatever level you're teaching at, and think about how your assessment is similar to or different from the examples that I'll run through here. Now, obviously, I don't have any from science, maths, the arts, languages, vocational education in this example. We don't have time to give examples from every single faculty, so you will need to contextualize and have a bit of a think about how this applies to your own disciplines. So the first example here comes from my own discipline of English and literature. And it's pretty common, both in secondary school and in tertiary English, language arts, and related subjects, to have this type of task where students have to submit a kind of writing portfolio. In this instance, we give the students the task at the beginning of a term. We have 10 weeks to work on the task, and then the students submit it to Turnitin, the plagiarism checker. The weighting of the task is 40% of the overall unit. And essentially, what the students have to do is complete one discursive piece and one imaginative piece of writing. Those pieces have to be 800 to 1,000 words in length each and are accompanied by a 300 to 400 word written justification, a reflection on their authorial choices. So if I just play this little video here and scroll through this assessment task sheet, pretty familiar territory if you're an English teacher. They've got to do a discursive topic that you feel a wider audience might consider, as well as a imaginative piece. Let's assume that in the class time, we've looked at some model writing, we've reflected and so on. And the assessment criteria involves the understanding of different voices, precise and purposeful use of language, sustained expression of ideas, and editing and analysis. So, as I said, this is a pretty common task for the English kind of subject area. And what we're going to do is, in a moment, we're going to look at how valid that task is before we even worry about generative artificial intelligence. And this will be a key of this process all the way through. We have to reflect on our tasks before we worry about the implications of the technology. Now, our business studies class, again, I've pitched this at a senior secondary level, but you could imagine this as a university level, perhaps an undergraduate first or second year course in business management, or any of those related subject areas, or even maybe as the business component of a vocational vet or TVET kind of course. So here we've got a task which is due in term 3, week 8, so about 2/3 of the way through a standard term. And we're going to assign this task in week 4. So overall, it's a task which spans about a month. The task description, we're going to write an extended response in class under timed conditions. So we've got 1 hour of writing time under examination conditions in the form of a business report responding to some questions based on an existing small and medium enterprise within the local area and compared to a global business such as Qantas, the airline. So the assessment task sheet provides some examples of, hypothetical local businesses, and we need to construct a situational analysis and evaluate the effectiveness of the marketing plan for the SME and the multinational. Now, there are quite a few outcomes being assessed here, 6 outcomes, as you can see on the screen there. And then we've got a pretty extensive marking rubric. We've got to do a SWOT analysis, make some well-reasoned judgments, apply case study and contemporary business issues knowledge, and write a report using the accurate kind of business terminology. Again, a pretty standard kind of assessment for this business management or business studies kind of topic. And again, just like the English one, we're going to review this assessment in light of some of the conversation we'll have in a moment around assessment validity before we worry about AI. And then finally, we've got this modern history assessment. Again, this could be year 11, year 12, perhaps a first year university course assessment. It's worth 35% of the overall course. It's got a 3-week time limit on it. And like the business management, we actually range across a whole broad scope here of different outcomes. Now, in this task, unlike the others, artificial intelligence is permitted up front, and there's a little task at the beginning worth 0 marks, so unscored, where an AI-generated explanation of causes and consequences can be used. Now, this can be used as part of the note-taking and preliminary research for a bigger task, which comes next in sections 2 and 3. For the criteria, we've got to look at a variety of sources, we've got to do 3 source analyses, and we have to do a variety of tasks, including the main task, which happens under supervised conditions. So we've got a lot of different types of task to look at here. Okay, they are all in that kind of English, humanities, social sciences scope. So again, if you're working in the arts, technologies, in the sciences, mathematics, contextualize the following discussions with whatever your assessment is that you're reviewing. So step 1 is to just put the assessments in front of us on the table. Okay, we might be working in a faculty group here. We might be just reviewing these on our own. Maybe you watching this are a faculty leader, a head of discipline, head of teaching and learning, or something like that. And we've got to get all of the assessments in front of us, make sure that we understand what we're asking the students to do. Once we've got the assessments in front of us, we then have to move on to talk about assessment validity. And this is really the big, important conversation. I've spoken a lot about assessment validity in the past, and I normally talk about this in the context of K-12 education. If you want some information on assessment validity in a higher education context, I strongly recommend checking up on the work of people like Philip Dawson, who's an academic here in Australia at Deakin University, and in particular, a paper that was published in 2024 called Validity Matters More Than Cheating. by Philip Dawson, Margaret Behrman, Molly Dollinger, and David Bowd. That's an excellent paper that's been used to contextualize a lot of these discussions about assessment validity in higher education here in Australia. When I talk about assessment validity, I'm normally using language from that K to 12 context and normally from a couple of specific jurisdictions here in Australia. But I'm sure that wherever you're teaching, and whether it's K to 12 or higher ed, you'll have your own language of assessment validity to draw on. Where I'm based here in Victoria, we have the VCAA, which is the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority. They set all of our rules and regulations around senior school assessment, particularly the VCE, the Victorian Certificate of Education, which is our senior school leaving certificate. And this is what the VCE says about assessment. Assessment should be valid and reasonable, and the curriculum content must be explicitly described, and assessment instruments should not assess learning that is outside the scope of a study design. So this is a really important point. I'm going to come back around to this in a short while when we review those assessments that we looked at before. But we should not assess learning outside the scope of the study design, the scope of what we've actually taught over the unit of work. We also need to make sure that each assessment instrument is administered under conditions that are substantially the same for all students undertaking the assessment. Now, again, when we get onto our conversation of generative artificial intelligence, this becomes really important because some students may have access to technologies which are significantly different to other students in your cohort. So let's have a look at this from the perspective of a higher education course. You've probably got students who are aged 18 and up. You may have mature age students. Students have access to their own discretionary spending. Some of them will have access to just the free versions of ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Gemini, and so on. You may have some students in there who have access to the plus or pro versions of these technologies, maybe paying upwards of $20 a month. A student who has access to GPT-5 Plus or even GPT-5 Pro, the highest tier, has access to something which is substantially very different to the free models. So if we allow students to complete examinations or assessments in unsupervised conditions with access to technologies, then there's a solid chance that we're breaching that second point there, that each assessment instrument must be substantially the same for all students. That means that we need to put measures in place when we're reviewing our assessments to ensure a equal level of access to the technologies, or equally that students cannot access the technologies. Now, we'll talk about this much later when we get into the discussion of step 3, when we review the use of generative AI in assessments and we talk about the AI assessment scale. So 2 important points from the Victorian curriculum. One, that we need to be making sure we're assessing something within the scope of the study design. And 2, that all of our assessments must be substantially the same for all students, equitable, in other words. Now, a little further north of me in Australia, in Queensland, with the Queensland Curriculum Assessment Authority, QCAA, they have a slightly different definition of assessment validity, but it's still useful to this conversation, whether we're in K to 12 or higher ed. This is the extent to which an assessment accurately measures what it's intended to measure. QCAA's language of assessment validity is much closer to the Australian tertiary sector's definition. If we look at some of the language of TEXA, our quality standards agency for the tertiary sector. And again, whatever jurisdiction you're working in, whether you're in the US, Canada, the UK, Europe, Southeast Asia, wherever you're teaching and whatever age levels you're teaching, I'm sure that your documentation has its own language around assessment validity. In QCAA's language, assessment instruments and performance descriptors must align to what is taught. This is referred to as content validity, and this is essentially what was talked about in the Victorian curriculum. Test what they claim to measure. This is construct validity, and I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. Reflect curriculum requirements, are authentic and appropriately challenging, provide realistic contexts, and allow students to demonstrate specified performance levels within the curriculum document. So again, a lot of that is wrapped up, like the Victorian definition, in Are we actually assessing what we've taught and what we mean to assess? That language of content validity and construct validity, which does draw heavily on the tertiary sector's language, is really important and something which we're going to review of those three assessments that I showed you earlier. So first of all, does it align to what is being taught? It sounds really, really obvious, but very often we're not actually assessing the exact materials or knowledge or skills that we taught during the sequence. And does it test what it claims to measure? The construct validity, again, sounds simple, but often we're not using the best form or mode of assessment to assess the knowledge that we've delivered in that curriculum. We'll talk about this with examples as we review those assessments that I brought up earlier. But this is the language that I want you to be thinking of as you review your own assessments as part of this process. And then NESA, this is New South Wales. And again, different jurisdictions, slightly different language, but still useful to us in this conversation. Each assessment task should be a valid instrument for what they're designed to assess. The important parts for this conversation are that once again, we need to link the achievement of students to specified standards. And importantly, through evidence collected from a number and variety of activities and from observations over time. Now, this again will be really important as we break down our existing assessments. Evidence from a number and variety of activities and observations over time. Not a single point of high stakes assessment. Not one exam at the end of a unit, but a series of assessments. It involves teachers gathering evidence formally and informally. Now, this is a really important point, whether we're in senior secondary or higher education. We need to provide avenues for teachers to collect evidence on student learning, but it can be formal and informal. It doesn't always need to be a high stakes assessment, which is moderated and marked on a huge rubric. It doesn't need to be something which is very workload intensive or very onerous for the teacher or the assessor or the person marking the work. Some of our understanding of what students can do, their knowledge and their skills, needs to be informed by these informal judgments. So those 2 points from NESA, we're collecting evidence from a variety of sources over time, and we're making formal and informal judgments. That kind of rounds off the picture of what validity means to me. So just a quick recap on that one from all of those jurisdictions, Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales here in Australia. A valid assessment needs to assess what we've actually taught in the best method possible. Those assessments need to be substantially the same for all of the students completing those assessments. The assessments need to be authentic, realistic, and they need to allow students to demonstrate work to the best of their ability. And we need to conduct multiple assessments over time, both formal and informal. So there's a lot going on there, okay? But we haven't even really mentioned artificial intelligence. So let's see how those existing assessments, the English, the business studies, and the history assessments, stack up next to my criteria for validity. So the English one, content validity, okay? Are we assessing what has been taught? Now, this is pretty strong. Throughout this unit, we'll assume that we've modeled texts, we've discussed discursive and imaginative texts, we've shared examples with students. So when we assess the student's ability to write, we're assessing what we've taught them in that unit of work. The construct validity, however, slips a little bit. Okay, I've given this maybe moderate to strong. We are assessing writing through a written piece. So that's okay, that's pretty good. However, we are only assessing a particular type of writing. We're assessing the end point. We're collecting in two pieces, 800 to 1,000 words, plus a reflection, okay, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, those 800 to 1,000 word pieces, that's a finished product, okay? And that's a finished product which, because the students go off and complete work outside of class, could have been extensively written by AI. There's no real acknowledgement in the criteria or in the process outlined in that task sheet that we are actually assessing the editing and drafting process. So in order for that construct validity to be a little bit better, I would say we need a few more points of clear assessment in that process where we're looking at draft work, we're looking at the students' use of their original drafts, their response to feedback, and their editing process. None of that really comes out in this assessment at the moment. As for the reflection, it's a pretty arbitrary task. And I know that from my own experience, students find that kind of task quite arbitrary, a bit tokenistic. We need to find ways to make that task more relevant for these students, more authentic. In the business studies task, again, we're not even talking about AI yet, we're just looking at the overall validity. Now, in this case, I would say the content validity, are we assessing what has been taught, is probably moderate at best. This task looks at a small and medium enterprise compared to a large multinational corporation and analyzes their marketing proposals and some of their literature to compare the various strengths and weaknesses. Are we actually covering all of those 6 areas that we said we were assessing on that task sheet? Okay, if you cast your mind back to the little screencast of the assessment task sheet, there was a lot going on there. In fact, I might just flick back to that so that we can have a quick look at that. So if we look at this task here, the outcomes that we're assessing, describing the nature of business and its role in society, describing the factors contributing to success or failure of medium and small enterprises, analyzing responsibilities, planning and conducting evaluations, evaluating information for actual and hypothetical business, communicating business ideas. I would wager that this assessment suffers from a really common issue with assessments, which is that it's just trying to do too much in one go. We probably haven't explicitly taught all of that information, so the content validity is off. And the methods which we're using, the exam conditions report writing, the SWOT analysis, the one page of handwritten notes, are probably not the best ways of assessing that knowledge. So again, the content validity is problematic and the construct validity, the method of assessment, is also quite weak. I think it also fails to assess authentic business thinking. We'll talk about this in a moment more when we get onto generative artificial intelligence. But I do think out in the wild, outside of education, this is exactly the kind of task that people might be using technologies like deep research for. So it seems a little bit arbitrary for me to make the students conduct this entire task under exam conditions. That seems more about security than validity. Finally, the history assessment. Again, like the English one, it's pretty good. We're assessing what we mean to assess, but construct validity is an issue. Are we using the best methods to assess this? The AI task is pretty arbitrary in this case. We allow students to use artificial intelligence to generate some of the contextual materials, but then we move back into those kind of supervised exam conditions to do everything else. It's heavily scaffolded. Okay, so I've got question marks over whether the students are really demonstrating the skills that they've learned over the course of the unit, or whether they're just kind of parroting back to them what we're putting in front of them. The important thing that I'm flagging here is that before we even talk about artificial intelligence, there are some serious red flags that we have to deal with in these assessments on a broader scale. So some of those red flags, which I've just covered, and some which are also worth talking about. This English task, one big red flag for me is this task runs for the full duration of the term, and then we just encourage students to submit it by Turnitin. If you've read any of my writing before, you'll know that Turnitin's AI detection tool is quite problematic in my opinion, and there's some research that supports that. We can't just rely on students going away, working for 10 weeks on a document which they're then going to submit electronically and relying on Turnitin as the authentication measure. I've also popped a red flag there on one of the criteria, which says that we're actually assessing their ability to edit and their ability to develop ideas. I don't think that we're assessing their ability to develop ideas or to edit their work in this mode of assessment. I think that's a problem with the construct validity, if we use that language, because we're really only assessing a finished piece of writing. So we've got 2 big red flags plus everything else that we discussed on the previous slide. In the business task, the biggest red flag for me, as I said, is that we are trying to assess too much in one go. with this assessment task. We're just trying to cover too much ground. There's no way that we taught all of this. There's no way that we're assessing all of this. And again, think of your own assessments, think of your own tasks in whatever your subject area is. Do you do this? I know I used to a lot. I used to cram a lot of performance descriptors or achievement standards into a single assessment, and it becomes a bit of an exercise in ticking boxes. The humanities one, as I mentioned, falls into a similar trap. We are trying to assess a lot of outcomes there all in one go. And also, we've got questions here over the actual appropriateness of the types of tasks that we're getting the students to do. This task here, question one, worth 5 marks, explain the usefulness of artificial intelligence to understanding historical events. Now, that might be an interesting task, but it's probably out of scope. Okay, we've probably got a little bit of content validity issue here. Not many history units of work or scope and sequence or curriculum more broadly actually include any dot points about understanding the implications of AI in history. So assessing students on this feels a little bit arbitrary. Some universities have certainly fallen into this trap recently. There was an article circulating a few months ago with the University of Sydney where some students were irate because the university was requiring them to write reflections on their use of AI in subjects like languages, foreign languages, and so on. And the students were saying, I'm not here to reflect on my use of AI. I'm here to talk about, learning French or whatever. And I think that's perfectly fair. If you're not teaching AI, then you shouldn't be assessing students on their ability to use AI. So, what do we talk about with artificial intelligence? And this is where it gets into the Gen AI conversation. And I've sort of facetiously given all three of these assessments 5 stars for how vulnerable they are to artificial intelligence. I think, by now, most of us would recognize that each of these tasks is very vulnerable. The English task, because it's essentially set and forget, we send them out of the classroom to do most of this work, is incredibly vulnerable to AI. We could generate the entire writing task from one end to the other. They might generate the reflection using artificial intelligence. We could do some superficial editing with AI. The students could take their entire draft, chuck it into ChatGPT, and we'd be none the wiser. It's going to be very difficult to detect if a student has used AI as long as they've used it well. So this is the key here. If you are using detection tools, or even worse, trying to detect AI use just by eye, we will catch students who are very heavy-handed with artificial intelligence, but a student who uses the technology in quite a sophisticated fashion will probably get away with it. The business studies task, now there was a section in that task, you may have noticed it, where students have to prepare a one-pager of notes and then take that with them into an examination conditions task. Obviously, the exam is a little bit more robust in the face of AI misuse, but that one-pager could have been written entirely by ChatGPT. They might be just rehearsing memorized AI content, which probably isn't going to help them in the long run. And the history task. There's a lot of different parts of this task, and there was some specific inclusion of AI. If you remember, the students could use AI to generate a summary of the historical revolution that they're writing about. And then there's that arbitrary 5-mark question where they reflect on that. But students can hide behind the AI's research using AI to generate entire sections, which they then memorize for later use, much like that business studies task. So we've got a few variations of different problems with artificial intelligence. They all sort of hinge on the same point, which is that if we're allowing students unsupervised to just head off and use artificial intelligence, we can't guarantee whether they've used it well. We can't guarantee whether they've generated the entire piece with artificial intelligence. We have very little control over those situations. So what do we actually do about all of those problems? First of all, in step 4, we talk about the validity of the overall task. Okay. Now remember, when we're talking about validity, are we assessing what we've taught? Are we using the best methods of assessment? Are we doing it over time in a variety of methods and forms and assessing that both informally and formally? In terms of breaking tasks down over time, in some subject areas, we do this really well. If I think about my time spent teaching VCE media, We used to have a folio-based approach to assessment where students would do some research, some design work, they would do some prototyping, then they would make a product, and then they would evaluate. But if I think about my time as an English teacher, often the assessment was contingent on one final piece of writing. This analogy of the Swiss cheese model comes from the world of risk assessment and has been applied in education, including in that validity matters more than cheating article that I mentioned earlier, to talk about a way that we can think of making more robust assessments by considering each task in the assessment process as its own little slice of Swiss cheese. So if we think about the NESA advice to run multiple assessments over time and in a variety of modes, each of those assessment tasks is its own slice of Swiss cheese. Every single task is full of holes, okay? And these are points at which a student could cheat or game their way through the assessment task. If it's a written piece, obviously, ChatGPT is a huge hole. But even in areas like mathematics and science, models like GPT-5 are increasingly proficient in those areas and could represent a big hole in the task if we let students unfettered access to technologies. But there are lots of holes in lots of different types of tasks. Okay, we've got contract cheating where we pay someone else to do it for us, getting mum or dad or a sibling or a friend to do the work instead, copying and pasting from Wikipedia, paragraph spinners, which are sort of 2022 and 2023 versions of AI technologies. All of these things represent different holes and different types of task. Written tasks, exams, quizzes, orals have different holes. So the logic goes, if we layer up a few different types of task, the holes don't exactly line up, and eventually you're going to dissuade most students from doing the wrong thing. It would certainly be very difficult for a student to just cheat their way through an entire unit from one end to the other. So I want you to hold this Swiss cheese idea in mind, and then I'm going to talk about our AI assessment scale and the implications of this for those Swiss cheese assessments. The AI assessment scale, some of you will be familiar with this, came out of my work with Mike Perkins, Jasper Rowe, and Jason McFaul. We published version 1 of the assessment scale in 2023, and then we updated to this version 2, in 2024. All of the resources to support the AI assessment scale can be found at aiassessmentscale.com. And I would encourage you after watching this webinar to go away and review some of those resources. They're all free, all open access, and that includes all of our journal articles, which contextualize where the scale came from, how we developed it, and some of the theory and the logic behind it. We've also got pilot studies where we've used this with particularly EAL students at British University Vietnam, and conversations about how we've used it and applied it in K-12, higher education, and vocational education. What's important for this webinar is how we might use it as part of this assessment redesign. Now, we see the assessment scale as an assessment design tool. Okay, so we're not just going to slap the assessment scale on a piece of work, tell the students you can only use the AI at level 2 or 3, and then hope that we've done the job of assessment design. Obviously, that's pretty tokenistic. A student could abuse that system, they could still misuse the technology. The AI assessment scale itself is not an assessment security tool. The way that we would use it is that we, the educators, review our existing assessments, including that conversation about whether it's valid and whether we need to break it down in those slices of Swiss cheese and maybe change that process over time. And then we look at each of those assessments and we judge where it would be best placed on the assessment scale. So for some types of knowledge and skills, no AI will be the best option. If a student can't demonstrate a particular skill where AI is involved, then we have to do it under some kind of controlled environment, ensuring that students rely on their own knowledge rather than technology. This is incredibly difficult to do if you're teaching exclusively online. If you're in an online or a distance education context and students always have access to technology, it's very difficult to secure the assessment in that way. But if you do see your students face to face, then this is where you make the most of that face-to-face time and you run assessments in class. It doesn't mean examinations exclusively. Okay, so an exam may be part of this conversation, but not every single thing needs to be an exam. And that's really important from the equity point of view, because we know that examinations disadvantage a huge portion of our students, ADHD, autistic, dyslexic students, and other ND students, students with physical disabilities, even students with problems outside of school or university, part-time jobs, carers' responsibilities, family problems. They don't do as well under exam conditions as some of their peers, and therefore we cannot justify doing all of our assessments as exams. But a no AI assessment could also be a discussion, a debate, some handwritten work in class, evidence of note taking. It could be an informal walk around by the teacher making observations of how students interact with their peers. As long as we've got no laptops, no phones, no Meta Ray-Bans or other smart devices in play, then we can make a no AI judgment. For everything else, we permit the use of artificial intelligence. Now, level two, we look at its use for research and idea development. Level three, for drafting, refining text, evaluating work, the use of chatbots as collaborators for getting feedback or creating a custom chatbot within a course to generate feedback on student work. Levels four and five, students are allowed to use any type of artificial intelligence, perhaps replicating the kind of tasks relevant to your industry sector outside of education, or maybe even just kind of pushing the boundaries of what's possible with the technology. Whenever we're in levels two, three, four, or five, permitting any use of AI is essentially permitting all use of AI. We, again, can't say to a student, please only use AI for planning and then stop and write the rest of your piece without AI assistance and submit it. We have to separate those two parts into two different slices of Swiss cheese. If you think of the research task as one slice and the writing task as another, we might do one at level two and one at level one. We might break the task down into a few stages. And this now brings our English style task, the first assessment that I gave as an example, something closer to that media studies example that I mentioned earlier, where we take a more folio-based approach. So to finish up this webinar, I'm going to give an example bringing together the Swiss cheese model and the AI assessment scale. We've considered the overall validity of the task. Perhaps we've made a few tweaks to the task along the way. You know, we've done something with the English task to justify the editing process and the drafting process a little bit more. Maybe in the business task, we recognize that that examination context is a little bit arbitrary, so we need to do something about that. And then we apply the understanding of the Swiss cheese model and the AI assessment scale. So in the English task, for example, we might begin with an initial in-class brainstorm and discussion of different types of writing, of different ideas, maybe some annotations of model text and author's work. And this is all done technology free. I'm going to informally assess this as the educator. Okay, this doesn't all need to be, again, collating really lengthy criteria-based assessments. I might just walk around the classroom and quickly jot down some informal judgments of how the students are talking to each other, how they're interacting. Maybe I could collect in some hard copies of their annotated passages if that's what we're doing. Maybe some hard copies or just take some photographs of their brainstorms and their initial planning. All of that evidence is still perfectly valid evidence of students' knowledge and skills. Then I'm going to move on to some AI assisted revisions of brainstorms. Now, they could do this out of class, okay? I don't need to supervise them doing this. But this task is its own separate slice of Swiss cheese. It's going to be judged on its own merit. I could just assess this as satisfactory or not satisfactory, or I could just collect it as a normal, informal piece of evidence in that overall chain of evidence. Now, if we've got the initial brainstorms and a record of that initial work, and then we have the AI assisted revisions, maybe the student bounces ideas around with the chatbot, refines their ideas, whatever. But if we have those two pieces of evidence, one at level one and one at level two, then we're starting to build up a picture of what the student can do both with and without AI. We might move back during class time to some in-class drafting with some teacher feedback. I might do this in a conferencing fashion where I'm just walking around a small group of students. Maybe we've got 3 or 4 lessons over a period of a couple of weeks where students are working on their drafting. And whilst they're doing that, I'm going around in person and giving feedback. Then they might use AI for editing. Now, I've got a copy of the draft at this stage. I've got their early brainstorming. So if there is a huge leap from here to there, we know we've got a problem. And then finally, those reflections perhaps are written under supervised, maybe even examination conditions. And we make it clear to students that this is a task whose sole purpose really is to validate the other points in that assessment chain. So we're not pretending that the reflection is this, huge important part of the actual written assessment itself. Most authors that I know don't sit down and write lengthy evaluations of their own writing once they've written a novel or an article. We acknowledge with the students that the purpose of the reflection is to add another piece of that evidence puzzle. In the business task, we might begin with AI. Okay, we're going to start with a level 2 task where students conduct research. Now, in the previous version of the task, version 1 of the task, students had to produce a handwritten page of notes. And I criticized that and said, maybe they could just get the AI to write the entire thing for them. They could, of course, get AI to write all of the research for them here. What we have to be conscious of is that we are teaching them methods of fact checking and talking about what this task actually looks like when we do it with AI. Now, they might bring that work into class and discuss it in person with their peers. And we might do that technology free. Maybe they bring a hard copy in or they bring their own handwritten notes based on the AI assisted research. We do the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis, and perhaps we do that under supervised conditions as well. And then we take all of that supervised in-class AI free work. We allow the students to bundle that up and take it with them outside of the classroom, where in a level 4 or 5 kind of task, they can use whatever AI they have access to. Now, in terms of equity, it might be helpful here if the school or university provides access to a certain platform, okay, and encourages that. We won't have much control over that if it's happening outside of class scope, but we could certainly put in place a few measures to support students with access to the technologies. Now, in version 1 of the task, everything was contingent on the examination style response. In this version, we still have an exam, but it's more of a revision exam at the end of the unit. It's much lower stakes, and it's only used to back up all of those other points of evidence. The important part here is that the actual main task, where the student writes a business report, is conducted with AI in a way which is probably much more authentic to how businesses out in the wild are actually using these technologies. Now, the last one here in class discussions of revolutions are what kicks us off. So it's a group task. We might be grading this task, just perhaps satisfactory or not satisfactory. But in the previous version, that was an AI task to start with. I've flipped that over entirely. I would much rather begin that work in person with no technology. And then, once we've done that in-person task, I'm going to move on to the AI-assisted part. Okay, so now we've got the initial conversations in class being backed up by the AI-assisted part. And at that point, I don't mind if they're using AI. They could use deep research, Google Gemini, ChatGPT, whatever they like, assuming I've taught them how to use those technologies responsibly. Like the English task, I'm going to do the drafting part in class, and I'm actually going to ungrade that task. So I'm going to remove it from the overall grading pile. This isn't the English assessment. My criteria does not include grading their drafting process, so I don't need to assess that part. But I do need it as part of that evidence chain because I'm then going to allow them to use AI for editing. It's permitted, but it's not compulsory. Not all students are going to want to use AI, and I'm certainly not going to evaluate their use of AI like I did in the original version of this task. Okay, so to finish up, I'll come back to the overview of the process and discuss what we did there. We took 3 assessments, the English, the business, the histories, and we initially reviewed them against the criteria that they were putting in front of us. This is what the task says. This is what the criteria is evaluating. Do those two things line up? We discussed those really important parts of validity. Okay. The content and construct validity, we need to be secure in that before we move on to AI. Then I recommended thinking about how vulnerable these tasks are to artificial intelligence. Now, I would recommend again you sit down in your faculty groups and you use the best available AI systems to complete the assessment yourself. You'll see pretty quickly where those vulnerabilities lie. With the English one, it was vulnerable from end to end. With the business one, they could use AI to generate their notes. With the history one, they could use AI to do all of their research. Plenty of holes in those assessment tasks. And then finally, we redesign the assessment. First of all, does it have that content and construct validity? Or do we need to change that assessment? Should it be broken into separate points of assessment? And then finally, using the AI assessment scale, where is AI okay and where is it not okay? Hopefully, this webinar has helped you to understand some of my thought processes, some of what I take faculty groups through when we work through their assessments. I do write a lot about assessments, and you may have seen on my website various collections of articles. I've got a collated ebook called Rethinking Assessment, and later in 2025, I'm going to be releasing an entirely new course called Redesigning Assessment, where I expand on some of these core principles and give lots more examples of how we do this in practice. You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Leon Furs, on my website at leonfurs.com, or via practicalaistrategies.com, where you'll find a collection of free and paid courses. Please get in touch anytime you have questions, and I will see you soon. Thanks.